The vultures knew death before it came. Thunderhawk watched them circle overhead, their black wings catching thermals that rose from the baked Arizona earth, like the spirits of the restless dead. Below in the scattered rocks, where diamondback rattlers sought shade, something moved pale against the red stone, stumbling with the desperate gait of the dying. A child. Thunderhawk's weathered hands tightened on his rifle as he dismounted his boots, crunching on sand that had been turned to glass by the merciless sun. The figure collapsed 50 yards away, small arms wrapped around something precious blonde hair, matted with what looked like dried blood. The Cheyenne chief approached, carefully scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Finding a white child alone in this wasteland meant only one thing somewhere behind her. Lay violence, and violence in this territory had a way of following its survivors like a hungry wolf. The girl looked up as his shadow fell across her, and Thunderhawk's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had seen too much, but they were familiar eyes. The shape, the color, even the stubborn set of her jaw reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. She clutched a blood-stained letter and what appeared to be a map, both pressed against her chest like shields against the world's cruelty. Her lips moved soundlessly, trauma having stolen her voice. But her desperate gestures spoke clearly enough. "Help me." Thunderhawk knelt beside her, offering water from his canteen. As she drank with desperate gulps, he gently pried the documents from her grip, his hands trembling as he recognized the careful script on the letter's envelope. To Thunderhawk, chief of the Northern Cheyenne, from his daughter Elizabeth. 20 years. 20 years since Elizabeth had run away with a white prospector, breaking her father's heart and dividing their people. The tribal council had declared her dead to them, but Thunderhawk had never stopped hoping she would return. Now she had through this terrified child who carried her blood. The letter's contents made Thunderhawk's world shift on its axis. "Father, if you read this, William and I are dead. The girl is Sarah, your granddaughter, your blood. Men came for our silver claim, led by a cavalry captain with cold eyes and a killer's smile. Captain Morrison told us we had two choices: sell the mine for a fraction of its worth or have it taken by force. When William refused, Morrison laughed and said, 'Dead men can't file claims. If we don't survive, the mine is hers by right and yours by heritage.' The map shows everything: the main vein, the processing area, even the hidden cache where we stored the refined silver. Use it to protect our people from men like Morrison. I never stopped being Cheyenne in my heart, Father. I taught Sarah our old ways, our language, our stories. She knows who she is. Protect her as you once protected me. Your lost bird." Thunderhawk studied the map with growing understanding. It showed detailed topographical features of the Dragoon Mountains, with multiple locations marked in Elizabeth's careful hand. The main mine was indicated by a large X, but there were other symbols too: smaller mining claims, processing facilities, and what appeared to be a substantial cache of refined silver ore. Notes in the margins indicated ore samples, yield estimates, and processing methods. This wasn't just a hole in the ground, but a sophisticated operation worth a king's ransom. Elizabeth had documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who knew death was coming. Sarah tugged at his sleeve, her small hands making urgent gestures. She pointed to herself, then to the map, then toward the northwest horizon. Her meaning was clear. She knew the way to the mine, and something there couldn't wait. But as Thunderhawk prepared to lift her onto his horse, Sarah suddenly grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed behind them toward a dust cloud rising in the distance. Riders moving fast, and they were coming this way. Thunderhawk swept Sarah up and spurred his horse toward a cluster of red rocks that would provide concealment. From their hiding place, they watched as a patrol of cavalry soldiers thundered past, led by a man in a captain's uniform whose cold blue eyes swept the landscape like a predator seeking prey. Even from a distance, Thunderhawk could see the cruelty in the officer's face, the way he sat his horse like a man accustomed to taking what he wanted by force. This had to be Morrison, the killer who had murdered Elizabeth and William for their silver. Sarah pressed herself against Thunderhawk's chest, her small body trembling with recognition and fear. Her fingers traced frantic patterns on his vest, the old hand language Elizabeth had taught her. "Death comes for me," she signed. "The blue man seeks me still." Thunderhawk held her close, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a burial shroud. Morrison wouldn't stop hunting until Sarah was silenced forever. The child was the only witness to his crimes, the only person who could testify to what had really happened at the silver mine. As the patrol disappeared into the desert haze, Thunderhawk made his decision. They would go to the Cheyenne camp, but carefully using the old trails that avoided the main routes. Sarah would need the protection of the entire tribe if she was to survive what was coming. The ride to the summer encampment took the rest of the day, Thunderhawk choosing a winding path through canyons and arroyos that would confuse any pursuit. Sarah sat before him in the saddle, her small hands gripping the saddle horn as she watched the landscape with the alertness of a hunted animal. As they rode, Thunderhawk taught her more of the hand language building on what Elizabeth had already shown her. It was a practical skill in a world where silence could mean the difference between life and death. But it was also a way of connecting with the heritage her mother had tried to preserve. "Your mother was brave," he signed to her during one of their rest stops. "She died protecting you and protecting our people's future." Sarah's response was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Will you protect me too, grandfather?" Thunderhawk's throat tightened as he signed back. "With my life, little one. With my life." The Cheyenne camp appeared below them as they crested a low ridge at sunset. 30 lodges, arranged in a careful circle. According to ancient tradition, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing in the dusty spaces between the dwellings. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but Thunderhawk knew how quickly that peace could shatter when the wrong word was spoken to the wrong person. White Bear rode out to meet them before they reached the camp's edge, his scarred face grim as he took in the sight of the blonde child clinging to Thunderhawk's chest. Behind him came 3 other warriors, their hands resting on their weapons as they surrounded the chief's horse. "Why do you bring trouble to our doorstep?" White Bear demanded, his voice carrying the authority of the war chief. "The Bluecoats patrol our borders daily, looking for any excuse to attack. They claim we've been raiding settlements, stealing cattle, kidnapping children." Thunderhawk met his old friend's gaze steadily. "This is Elizabeth's daughter. My granddaughter." White Bear's expression hardened like cooling iron. "Lost Bird chose her path 20 winters ago. She left us for the white world, broke her father's heart, divided our people. Her child has no place here." Other warriors had gathered now, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Thunderhawk could feel their tension, their fear of what harboring a white child might bring down upon them. The summer camp held not just warriors, but their families, wives, children, elders who couldn't run far or fast if soldiers came seeking vengeance. "She has Cheyenne blood," Thunderhawk said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "That makes her our responsibility, our family." "Family!" White Bear spat into the dust. What did Lost Bird's family mean to her when she ran away with her white lover? What did our ways mean to her when she chose their world over ours? Singing Crow, Thunderhawk's sister, and the tribe's medicine woman pushed through the crowd of warriors. Her weathered face was kind but cautious as she approached her healer's instincts, taking precedence over politics. "The child is injured," she observed quietly, noting the cuts and bruises that marked Sarah's pale skin. "And exhausted. Whatever brought her here, she needs healing first." Thunderhawk nodded gratefully to his sister. "Her wounds are not the worst she carries. Someone has hurt her in ways that go deeper than flesh." Singing Crow knelt before Sarah, her movement slow and non-threatening. She spoke in Cheyenne, her voice soft and musical. And to everyone's amazement, Sarah responded in the same language, halting and careful, but unmistakably fluent. "She says men came to her home. Singing Crow translated her expression, growing grave. Men with guns led by a soldier in blue. They hurt her parents, tied them up, demanded something about silver. When her parents wouldn't tell them what they wanted, the soldiers shot them both. The crowd of warriors fell silent, and their hostility replaced by a different kind of tension. This wasn't just about harboring a white child. This was about murder, about the kind of violence that could easily spill over into their own lives. Rope burns. Singing Crow continued examining Sarah's wrists more closely. And this blood on her dress, most of it isn't hers. She saw everything, heard everything. That's why she's here. She's running from the killers. Thunderhawk pulled Elizabeth's letter from his vest, the blood-stained paper rustling in the evening breeze. She's running from Captain Morrison and his men. They killed her parents for a silver mine worth more than all our horses and cattle combined. He read portions of the letter aloud, translating Elizabeth's words into Cheyenne. The assembled warriors listened with growing amazement as they heard about the mine's wealth, about Morrison's threats and ultimatums, about Elizabeth's final desperate attempt to protect her daughter and secure her people's future. "A fortune in silver," murmured Grey Wolf, the war chief. "Enough to buy weapons, horses, supplies, for years of fighting if necessary." "Or enough to buy peace," Thunderhawk countered. "Enough to hire white lawyers to purchase influence in Washington, to secure our lands through their own legal system, instead of fighting endless wars we cannot win." White Bear shook his head stubbornly. "You speak of dreams, old friend. The white man's greed knows no bounds. They will take the silver and still drive us from our lands. They will promise us justice and deliver only death." "Perhaps," Thunderhawk acknowledged. "But would you rather face that future as beggars with nothing but our weapons, or as people with the means to fight back in their courts with their lawyers using their own laws against them?" The debate continued as the sun set and the cooking fires were lit. Warriors argued with their wives, elders counseled caution, while young men spoke of war. Through it all, Sarah sat quietly beside Singing Crow, eating her first real meal in days, while the adults decided her fate. As the discussion grew more heated, Sarah stood and walked to the center of the circle. Her small voice cut through the adult arguments like a knife through leather. "My mother told me stories," she said in careful Cheyenne, her pronunciation improving with each word. "Stories about brave people who helped each other, who protected the weak, who fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous." The warriors fell silent, startled by the child's composure and the strength in her young voice. "She told me about my grandfather, about how he led his people with wisdom and courage. She said if something bad happened to us, I should find him and tell him the truth about the bad men who hurt us." Sarah pulled out a small leather pouch from around her neck, something Thunderhawk hadn't noticed before. From it, she withdrew a silver pendant carved with traditional Cheyenne symbols. "Mama gave me this," she continued, holding up the pendant so everyone could see. "She said it would remind me who I am, where I come from. She said no matter what happened, I would always be Cheyenne in my heart." Thunderhawk's eyes filled with tears as he recognized the pendant one he had made for Elizabeth when she was Sarah's age, before the white world had claimed her. His daughter had kept it all these years, had treasured it, despite choosing a different path. "The bad man wants to kill me, so I can't tell anyone what he did," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "But if I stay hidden, if I don't speak the truth, then my parents died for nothing. Mama wrote down everything in her papers. She wanted the silver to help keep everyone safe." She looked around the circle of faces, meeting each warrior's gaze with remarkable composure for someone so young. "I'm not asking you to die for me," she said simply. "I'm asking you to help me live long enough to tell the truth, to make sure the bad man pays for what he did." The silence that followed was profound. Even White Bear seemed moved by the child's words, his hostility replaced by something approaching respect. Old Man Crow, the eldest of the council, spoke in a voice like grinding stone. The child speaks with wisdom beyond her years. But wisdom alone will not stop soldiers' bullets or protect our families from the white man's revenge. No, Thunderhawk agreed. But perhaps wisdom combined with wealth can do what neither could accomplish alone. Morrison's corruption runs deep. He has allies, people who profit from his crimes. If we can expose them all, if we can use their own greed against them. The debate resumed, but Thunderhawk could see the tide turning. The combination of Sarah's courage, Elizabeth's evidence, and the promise of silver wealth was too compelling to ignore. When the final vote was called, it was narrow but decisive. They would protect Sarah and seek out the silver mine. But they would also prepare for war, because Morrison would not give up his prize without a fight. As the council dispersed, families returning to their lodges for the night, Singing Crow approached her brother with worry etched deep in the lines of her face. "But Morrison will not wait," she warned. "Men like him make their own rules, follow their own timetables. He'll come for her long before we're ready." Thunderhawk nodded grimly. "Which is why we leave at dawn. Take Sarah and 20 of our best warriors to find the mine. The rest will stay here to maintain the illusion that nothing has changed. And if Morrison attacks while we're gone, then White Bear will lead our people into the hills and wait for our return." Thunderhawk looked toward Singing Crow's lodge, where Sarah was finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. "One way or another, this ends at the mine. Either we find enough silver to buy our freedom, or we make our stand there and trust the spirits to judge who deserves to win." Singing Crow studied her brother's face in the flickering firelight. "You know this is likely a death sentence for all of us." "Perhaps," Thunderhawk replied quietly. "But some things are worth dying for. Family is one of them. Justice is another. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, dying for the right cause can save more lives than living for the wrong one." That night, Thunderhawk sat alone outside his lodge, cleaning his rifle and watching the stars wheel overhead. The desert night was cold after the blazing heat of the day, and somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other with voices that sounded almost human. He thought about Elizabeth, about the daughter he had lost and found again through her child. Had he failed her by not fighting harder to keep her from leaving? Had his pride and anger driven her away when she needed him most? Sarah emerged from Singing Crow's lodge, wrapped in a blanket against the chill. She sat beside him without speaking, her small presence a comfort in the vastness of the night. "I dream about them," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Mama and Papa. The bad man keeps asking them questions, hurting them when they won't answer. I try to help, but I can't move, can't speak." Thunderhawk put his arm around her shoulders, feeling how small and fragile she was beneath the blanket. Dreams of the dead are not always dreams, little one. Sometimes they are messages, warnings, requests for help we cannot give. "Mama used to tell me that the dead don't really leave us," Sarah said. "She said they watch over the people they love, that they guide us when we need help the most." "Your mother was wise," Thunderhawk replied. "Wiser than I understood when she was alive. I was angry when she left, angry that she chose a different path than the one I would have chosen for her. But perhaps her path led exactly where it needed to go, to you, to this moment, to the chance to right a great wrong." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Then she asked the question that had been troubling her since their first meeting. "Why didn't you come looking for her? Why didn't you try to bring her home?" Thunderhawk felt the weight of 20 years of regret settle on his shoulders. "Because I was proud and stubborn and afraid. Afraid that if I went looking for her, I would find that she was truly happy in the white world, that she had no place in her heart for her old life. Sometimes it's easier to live with the pain of loss than to risk the pain of rejection." She never forgot. Sarah said firmly, "She taught me your language, your stories, your ways. She told me about the summers when you taught her to track deer, to read the sky for weather, to listen to the desert's voice. She said you were the best man she had ever known, and that someday she would bring me to meet you. Thunderhawk's throat tightened with emotion. But not like this. Not running from killers, not orphaned and alone. No. Sarah agreed. But maybe this is how it was supposed to happen. Maybe Mama knew that only something this terrible would bring us together, would make you fight for something bigger than just keeping the peace. Her words carried a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. And Thunderhawk found himself wondering if Elizabeth's spirit was indeed speaking through her daughter, guiding them toward a destiny none of them could fully understand. The pre-dawn darkness was crisp and sharp when Thunderhawk's expedition prepared to depart. He had chosen his warriors carefully, men he trusted with his life and the lives of their families. Grey Wolf would lead the fighters while Singing Crow served as healer and interpreter of Elizabeth's maps and notes. Sarah herself had insisted on coming despite the dangers. She knew the location of the mine better than anyone, and her presence might be crucial if they encountered any of Morrison's men. More importantly, she refused to be left behind, where she couldn't influence her own fate. "I'm not hiding anymore," she told Thunderhawk as he helped her onto his horse. "Running away didn't save my parents, and it won't save your people. It's time to fight back." They rode out in single file, using old hunting trails that wound through the Badlands toward the mining country. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, red rock formations carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes, deep arroyos that could hide an army or become death traps for the unwary scattered patches of desert vegetation that provided scant cover for man or beast. Thunderhawk had Sarah ride with him, her small body pressed against his back as his horse picked its way through the treacherous terrain. Behind them, 18 of the tribe's finest warriors followed in silence, their weapons ready, and their faces painted for war according to the old traditions. The first sign of trouble came at midday, when Grey Wolf spotted dust clouds on the horizon behind them. Too much dust for a small patrol, too organized for a hunting party or trading expedition. 40 riders, maybe more, he reported grimly after studying the distant signs through his spyglass. Soldiers and civilians mixed. They're pushing hard to catch us riding their horses into the ground. Thunderhawk studied the terrain ahead with tactical eyes. The mine lay in a box canyon still 20 miles away, through increasingly dangerous country where a few defenders could hold off an army, but where there was also no retreat if things went wrong. Morrison had broken his own 3-day deadline, which meant he was either desperate or had received new orders from higher up the chain of command. Either way, it suggested that the captain was under pressure to resolve this situation quickly and permanently. "How far behind us?" Thunderhawk asked. 3 hours, maybe 4. Grey Wolf replied. "But they're gaining ground. We can't outrun them with the child to consider." Thunderhawk made a decision that went against every instinct for survival. Instead of continuing toward the mine, they would make a stand at Devil's Throat, a narrow canyon pass that controlled access to the mining district. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was also their best chance to even the odds against Morrison's superior numbers. "We stop running," he announced to his warriors. "We make them come to us on ground of our choosing." Devil's Throat Canyon was well named, a narrow passage between towering red stone walls that had been carved by millennia of flash floods. The canyon floor was barely wide enough for 2 horses to ride abreast, while the walls rose nearly 300 feet on either side, riddled with caves and ledges that provided perfect positions for defenders. Thunderhawk positioned his warriors among the rocks, with the skill of a general who had fought more battles than he cared to remember. Their rifles and traditional bows commanded overlapping fields of fire over the canyon floor, while escape routes were prepared in case the position became untenable. Sarah he hid in a protected alcove high on the canyon wall with Singing Crow to watch over her, and several warriors positioned to defend their position. The child had wanted to stay with him, but Thunderhawk knew that the coming battle would be no place for someone so young, regardless of her courage. They didn't have long to wait. Morrison's column appeared at the canyon mouth, just as the sun reached its zenith, the captain's blue uniform bright against the red stone backdrop. Thunderhawk counted carefully. 28 regular soldiers, 15 civilians, who looked like professional gunfighters, and 3 men in expensive suits who were clearly not used to desert warfare. Government officials, Thunderhawk realized. Morrison had brought witnesses to his victory people, who could testify that the Cheyenne had been given every chance to surrender peacefully before force was used against them. Morrison rode forward alone, his hands held high in the traditional gesture of parley. His voice echoed off the canyon walls as he called out his offer. "Thunderhawk, I know you're up there, you old fox. I've come to make you a final offer, one that's more generous than you deserve." Thunderhawk stood up from his concealment on a ledge halfway up the canyon wall, making himself visible to Morrison's men. "I'm listening, Captain." "The girl for safe passage." Morrison shouted back, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Hand her over, and you and your men can ride away. No one else has to die today, and your people can continue living peacefully on their reservation." Thunderhawk pretended to consider the offer, using the time to study Morrison's positions and count ammunition loads. The captain had brought enough firepower to reduce the canyon to rubble, but he would also lose a significant number of his own men in the process. "And if I refuse?" Thunderhawk called back. Morrison's smile was cold and predatory, visible even at a distance. "Then you all die here in this canyon, and I take the girl anyway. Your choice, savage, an easy death, or a hard one." A new voice cut through the desert air. Judge Harrison, one of the well-dressed civilians Thunderhawk had noticed among Morrison's men. "Captain, perhaps we should discuss proper legal procedures for handling this situation." "Shut up, Harrison." Morrison snapped his mask of professionalism, slipping for just a moment. "I'm handling this my way." The brief exchange was illuminating. Harrison wasn't entirely comfortable with Morrison's methods, which suggested that the judge might have been told a different story about what was happening here. That discomfort might prove useful if the situation deteriorated further. 1 hour, Thunderhawk called back. "I need time to consult with my warriors and consider your offer." Morrison checked his pocket watch with theatrical precision. 1 hour, old man. Then I come up there and take what I want, and damn the consequences. As Morrison rode back to his men, Thunderhawk gathered his war leaders for a quick conference. Grey Wolf's assessment was characteristically blunt and grim. "We can hold them for a while, maybe even break their first assault if we're lucky. But they have too many men and too much ammunition. If they're willing to take heavy losses, they'll overrun us eventually." Escape routes. Thunderhawk asked, though he already knew the answer. Singing Crow pointed deeper into the canyon, toward where the walls converged into an almost impassable narrows. "There's a hidden trail that leads to the mine shaft, narrow, dangerous, barely wide enough for one person at a time. It might work for a few people, but not all of us." Thunderhawk studied the terrain with the eyes of a man who had spent his life reading the landscape for signs of danger and opportunity. These men had followed him into this trap because they trusted his judgment, because they believed in protecting family and fighting for justice. Now he had to decide which of them would live and which would die. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, with the desert sun beating down on them and the sound of Morrison's men preparing for battle echoing off the canyon walls. Grey Wolf, take 10 men and prepare a fighting retreat toward the mine. Thunderhawk decided. Make them pay for every yard, but don't sacrifice yourselves needlessly. The goal is to buy time, not to win a glorious death. What about the child? Grey Wolf asked. Singing Crow will take Sarah and use the hidden trail to reach the mine directly. Once they're secure, whatever silver you can find and prepare for a siege. If we don't join you within 2 days, take what you can carry and head for the winter camp. And you? Grey Wolf asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Thunderhawk checked his rifle and adjusted his war paint according to the old traditions. Someone has to buy you time. Someone has to make Morrison think he's getting what he came for. But as the hour deadline approached, Morrison made an unexpected tactical move that changed everything. Instead of waiting for Thunderhawk's answer, he split his force half would assault the canyon from the front, while the other half moved to block the rear exit. The captain had done his homework on Devil's Throat Canyon and knew all its secrets. Trap within a trap. Grey Wolf muttered as they watched Morrison's men take their positions. He's cleverer than we gave him credit for. Thunderhawk felt the walls closing in around them, but kept his voice steady and confident. Then we spring our own trap. Sometimes the best way to escape an ambush is to make the ambushers think they've already won. He stood up on his ledge, making himself a clear target for Morrison's sharpshooters, and called down to the captain with his decision. Captain Morrison, I accept your offer. The girl for safe passage, you have my word as a chief of the Cheyenne people. Morrison's triumphant laugh echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a hunting hawk. I knew you'd see reason eventually, old man. You savages always do when faced with superior firepower. Thunderhawk began climbing down the canyon wall, moving deliberately slowly to give Singing Crow and Sarah time to reach the hidden trail. Every step felt like a betrayal of his warrior's trust, but he knew that sometimes the greatest victory required the appearance of the greatest defeat. He reached the canyon floor just as Morrison rode forward with his personal entourage, the 3 government officials, 2 of his most trusted subordinates, and Judge Harrison, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Morrison's eyes gleamed with anticipation as he surveyed his prize. Where's the girl, Chief? Don't tell me you've lost track of your own granddaughter. Thunderhawk had been preparing for this moment, had known that Morrison's real intentions would be revealed once he thought he had won. He pulled Sarah's leather pouch from around his neck, the one containing Elizabeth's letter, and held it up for all to see. Well, the girl is safe, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the canyon. But before you murder us all, Captain, perhaps you'd like to explain to these government officials why you killed Elizabeth and William Hartley for their silver mine. Morrison's face went white with rage, his careful mask of military professionalism cracking like thin ice. You lying savage, I never... But Thunderhawk's voice continued to boom across the canyon, reading from Elizabeth's detailed account of Morrison's extortion attempts, his threats, his final ultimatum to sell the mine or face the consequences. Judge Harrison was frantically scribbling notes, his face pale with shock as he realized the implications of what he was hearing. Stop his lying mouth, Morrison screamed, drawing his sidearm. Kill him now. Morrison's first shot went wide, the bullet chipping stone near Thunderhawk's feet. The old chief didn't stop reading Elizabeth's testimony, his voice growing stronger with each word as he recited the evidence of Morrison's corruption. Morrison fired again, and this time the bullet found its mark, sending Thunderhawk stumbling backward with blood spreading across his chest. But even as he fell, the chief kept reading, his voice never wavering, until Grey Wolf's warriors opened fire from the canyon walls. The narrow space erupted in gunfire and screaming horses as Morrison's men found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. The government officials dove for cover behind their horses, while Morrison's soldiers tried to return fire at targets they could barely see among the rocks. The battle raged for 3 hours, the canyon walls amplifying every shot into rolling thunder that could be heard for miles. Morrison's superior numbers and firepower gradually began to tell, but the Cheyenne made them pay dearly for every position they took. Thunderhawk, mortally wounded but still alive, managed to crawl to a sheltered position where he could continue directing his warriors' defense. Blood loss was making him weak, but his mind remained sharp as he coordinated the fighting retreat toward the hidden trail. One by one, his warriors fell back through the prepared positions, each man covering the retreat of his brothers with disciplined fire. Grey Wolf was the last to leave, carrying Thunderhawk's unconscious form toward the trail entrance, as Morrison's men finally overran the main defensive positions. When the shooting finally stopped, Morrison stood among the bodies of his own men, his uniform stained with blood, and his face twisted with rage. He had won the canyon, but at a terrible cost. Nearly half his force lay dead or wounded among the rocks. "Where is she?" he screamed at the captured Cheyenne warriors, his voice cracking with frustration. "Where's the girl?" But the survivors would tell him nothing, even under torture. They had bought Thunderhawk's granddaughter the time she needed to escape, and they would die before betraying that trust. Meanwhile, deep in the maze of mining tunnels, Sarah and Singing Crow had used the chaos of the battle to reach the heart of Elizabeth's operation. The mine was far more extensive than the map had indicated, a complex network of shafts and chambers that had been carved by months of careful excavation. In the deepest chamber, they found what Elizabeth had died protecting. Veins of pure silver ran through the rock like frozen lightning, some as thick as a man's arm, gleaming in the light of their torches. Scattered around the chamber were leather pouches filled with already extracted ore, the refined silver worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. But more importantly, hidden in a series of waterproof containers, they discovered Elizabeth's complete records of Morrison's criminal enterprise. The captain's corruption was documented in meticulous detail: payments to known criminals, threats against honest miners, correspondence with corrupt officials throughout the territorial government. Sarah clutched her mother's final journal, tears streaming down her face as she read Elizabeth's last entries. Morrison came again today with his final offer: sell the mine for 1/10 of its value or face the consequences. When William refused, I saw murder in the captain's eyes. "We're leaving for Father's camp at first light. If we don't make it, someone must expose Morrison's crimes. The silver belongs to the Cheyenne people, use it to secure their future and buy the justice we couldn't find in this corrupt territory." Singing Crow studied the mine tunnels with the eye of someone who had spent her life reading the signs of the natural world. The excavations were expertly done, following the silver veins with precision that spoke of real mining knowledge. Elizabeth and William had known what they were doing, and they had created something that could fund a small army or buy enough political influence to protect an entire tribe. "Your mother was wise," Singing Crow told Sarah as they gathered what silver they could carry. "She saw what this mine could mean for our people's future. But first, we must survive to use it." The sound of voices echoed from the main tunnel, growing closer with each passing minute. Morrison's men had found the mine entrance and were methodically searching every chamber. The captain's voice boomed through the passages, promising death to anyone who harbored the girl. Singing Crow consulted Elizabeth's detailed maps of the mine workings, looking for alternative routes to the surface. There, a narrow ventilation shaft that connected to abandoned workings on the far side of the mountain. It would be a dangerous climb, especially for a child, but it was their only chance of escaping undetected. They began the treacherous ascent through the shaft, just as Morrison's search parties reached the main silver chamber. The space was barely wide enough for an adult, its walls slick with moisture and unstable with decades of accumulated debris. Singing Crow went first, testing each handhold and foothold before allowing Sarah to follow. The child climbed with grim determination, her small hands bleeding from the rough stone, but never hesitating. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's voice booming with rage as he discovered the silver but found no trace of his quarry. The climb seemed endless, but finally they emerged into sunlight on the mountain's far slope. From their vantage point, they could see Morrison's men still searching the main mine entrance, their torches flickering like fallen stars in the darkness of the tunnels. But their escape had not gone entirely unnoticed. A lone rider emerged from the rocks below one of Morrison's bounty hunters, who had been watching the mine's back entrances while his companions searched the tunnels. The scarred man raised his rifle with practiced efficiency, drawing a bead on Singing Crow's silhouette against the sky. Sarah screamed a warning in Cheyenne, just as the rifle cracked and the bullet whined off the rocks where they had been standing. Singing Crow threw herself sideways, pulling Sarah with her as they tumbled down the steep mountainside, bouncing off boulders and scraping against thorny bushes until they came to rest in a narrow ravine. The bounty hunter was already reloading his horse, picking its way carefully up the mountain trail toward their position. He was a professional killer patient and methodical, and he knew that wounded prey was often more dangerous than healthy prey. Singing Crow checked Sarah for injuries, cuts, and bruises, but nothing serious, then drew her knife. It was a pitiful weapon against a rifle, but it was all she had to protect Thunderhawk's granddaughter. Sarah tugged at her arm, pointing toward a narrow cleft in the rocks that led deeper into the ravine. The child had spotted something. Singing Crow had missed a hidden passage that might offer escape from their pursuer. They squeezed through the cleft just as the bounty hunter reached the edge of the ravine. His frustrated curse echoed off the stone walls as he realized his quarry had vanished again. But this man was persistent. He dismounted and began following them on foot, his rifle ready, and his patience wearing dangerously thin. The chase continued through the night, a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocks and canyons of the high desert. The bounty hunter was skilled and determined, tracking them by sound and instinct through terrain that would have defeated a lesser man. But Singing Crow knew this country like her own heartbeat, and Sarah proved remarkably adept at moving silently through the darkness. They used every trick Thunderhawk had ever taught them, doubling back on their own trail, walking in stream beds to mask their footprints, climbing over rock faces that would leave no trace of their passage. The bounty hunter stayed with them through it all, his relentless pursuit driving them deeper into the wilderness. As dawn broke over the mountains, they finally lost their pursuer in a maze of box canyons and false trails. Exhausted and bleeding from dozens of small cuts, they made their way toward the winter camp, where Chief Stonebear could protect them and decide how to use the evidence they carried. But their ordeal was far from over. Morrison would not give up easily, and the captain had resources they could barely imagine. The real battle was just beginning. 3 days later, Sarah sat in Chief Stonebear's lodge in the high mountain camp, her small hands working with traditional beadwork, while the tribal council debated her fate. The winter camp was larger than the summer settlement, 50 lodges arranged in concentric circles according to ancient custom, with the chief's lodge at the center and the warriors' lodges forming the outer ring. Stonebear was a different man than his brother Thunderhawk, had been younger, more aggressive, with a warrior's scars marking his face and hands. Where Thunderhawk had sought accommodation with the white world, Stonebear believed in meeting force with force, violence with violence. The news of Thunderhawk's death had hit the winter camp like a physical blow. Warriors wept openly for their fallen chief, while the women began the ritual mourning songs that would continue for days. But beneath the grief was a burning anger that Stonebear was more than willing to channel into action. "My brother died for this child," Stonebear declared, holding up Elizabeth's journals and the evidence of Morrison's crimes. "His sacrifice will not be meaningless. We will use this silver to buy weapons, to hire our own lawyers, to fight the white man's corruption with his own tools." But White Bear, who had survived the canyon massacre by playing dead among the corpses, raised a dissenting voice. "More soldiers will come now. Morrison will not rest until the girl is dead and his crimes buried with her. We risk the lives of every person in this camp, men, women, children, elders who cannot fight." Singing Crow stood her medicine woman's authority, carrying weight even in a war council. "The child is not just Thunderhawk's granddaughter. She is the daughter of Lost Bird who chose to walk between two worlds. Sarah carries the blood of both peoples. She represents our future, not our burden." The debate grew heated as warriors argued with their wives, as elders counseled caution, while young men spoke eagerly of war. Through it all, Sarah sat quietly, understanding more of the Cheyenne words than the adults realized. She had been learning rapidly during her time with the tribe, her young mind absorbing the language and customs with remarkable speed. Finally, she stood and walked to the center of the lodge, her small voice cutting through the heated arguments like a blade through leather. "I want to speak," she said in carefully pronounced Cheyenne, her accent improving with each day of practice. The council fell silent, startled by the child's composure and the growing strength in her young voice. Stonebear studied her with new interest, seeing perhaps something of Thunderhawk's wisdom reflected in her determined eyes. "The bad man killed my parents. Sarah continued switching to English so everyone could understand her words. He wants to kill me too, so no one will ever know what he did. But if I run away and hide, he wins. If I stay silent, he gets the silver and hurts more people. She pulled her mother's letter from its protective pouch, holding it up for all to see. The blood-stained paper seemed to glow in the firelight, a testament to the price that had already been paid. My mama wrote that the silver belongs to the Cheyenne people. She wanted it to help keep everyone safe, to build a future where her daughter could grow up in peace. I want to do what Mama wanted, what grandfather died trying to do. White Bear shook his head grimly, his scarred face reflecting years of bitter experience. Child, you don't understand the danger we all face. Morrison has soldiers' weapons, the power of the territorial government behind him. He can call us hostile Indians and bring the entire U.S. Army down on our heads. Sarah met his gaze steadily, her young face showing a determination that was startling in someone so small. He also has secrets. Bad secrets that important white people don't want other white people to know about. Mama taught me that truth is stronger than lies if you're brave enough to tell it to the right people. Stone Bear leaned forward, intrigued despite his grief and anger. What do you mean, little one? Sarah pulled out her mother's final journal, the one that documented Morrison's extortion attempts and threats in careful detail. Mama wrote down everything, names, dates, what the bad man said when he thought no one was listening. There's a judge who helps him and businessmen who buy stolen claims and politicians who take money to look the other way. She opened the journal to a page covered with Elizabeth's meticulous handwriting. If the right people knew about this, if honest lawmen saw this proof, understanding dawned on Stone Bear's weathered face. The child was right. Morrison's corruption went much deeper than simple murder for silver. If they could expose the full scope of his criminal network, they might be able to destroy him through the white man's own legal system. You want to testify against him? Stone Bear said slowly. In their courts before their judges. Sarah nodded solemnly. But not alone and not helpless. With lawyers we hire with the silver money, and with all the proof Mama left behind, and with honest people who care more about justice than about money. The council erupted in debate, voices raised in argument and concern. The idea of trusting white justice was difficult for people who had seen so little of it in their lifetimes. But the alternative, endless war against an enemy with superior numbers and firepower held little appeal either. The bad man thinks I'm just a scared little girl who will hide in the mountains forever. Sarah continued when the noise died down. He doesn't know that I remember everything I saw, everything I heard. He doesn't know about all the papers Mama hid, or about the silver that could buy real justice instead of the fake kind he sells. Stone Bear studied the child's face in the flickering firelight, seeing something of his brother's wisdom combined with a steel that was entirely her own. Thunderhawk had died, believing this girl was worth protecting, and perhaps he had seen something the rest of them were only beginning to understand. The debate continued long into the night, but gradually the tide began to turn. The combination of Sarah's courage, Elizabeth's evidence, and the promise of silver wealth was compelling. More importantly, the idea of fighting Morrison on legal ground, where the captain would be less comfortable and less able to use his military advantages, offered hope for a victory that wouldn't require the destruction of their entire people. When the final vote was called, it was closer than Stone Bear would have liked, but still decisive. They would protect Sarah and use the silver mine's wealth to hire the best lawyers in the territory. They would fight Morrison's corruption in the courts rather than on the battlefield seeking justice through the white man's own system. But they would also prepare for war because men like Morrison didn't surrender their power easily. The answer to their tactical dilemma came from an unexpected source 3 days later. Judge Harrison arrived at the winter camp under a flag of truce, his face haggard with sleepless nights and moral conflict. He rode alone without guards or weapons, trusting to the traditional respect for a parley flag. Stone Bear met him at the camp's edge with a dozen warriors, their weapons ready, but not openly threatening. The judge looked older than his years, worn down by whatever knowledge he carried. "I've come to make amends," Harrison announced without preamble. "Morrison is a murderer and a thief, and I won't be party to his crimes any longer." He produced an official territorial warrant, the paper bearing the seal of the governor himself. Morrison's corruption has finally attracted attention from people he can't intimidate or bribe. This warrant charges him with multiple counts of murder, extortion, and conspiracy against the territorial government. Sarah studied the judge with intelligent eyes, her small face serious as she weighed his words. "Why should we trust you? You were there when my grandfather died. You watched Morrison shoot him and did nothing to stop it." Harrison dismounted and knelt before the child, his voice heavy with remorse. "Because I was a coward then, and I'm trying to find the courage to do what's right now. Because Morrison threatened to kill me if I testified about what I witnessed, and I realized that if he'll murder a child's grandparents in cold blood, he'll eventually murder anyone who knows his secrets." He pulled out a thick folder of documents, his hands shaking slightly as he held them out. "These are Morrison's financial records obtained through unofficial channels. They show payments to known criminals, deposits of silver ore that match your parents' mine correspondence with corrupt officials throughout the territorial government." The judge spread the papers on the ground between them, pointing to specific entries and dates. "Combined with your testimony and your mother's evidence, these documents can destroy Morrison completely. We can expose not just him, but the entire network of corruption he's built over the years." Stone Bear examined the documents with growing satisfaction, his scarred hands tracing the evidence of Morrison's crimes. "And the soldiers who follow him, the men who died attacking our people in the canyon?" Harrison's face was grim. "Most of those soldiers were good men who were lied to about what they were doing. They thought they were hunting child killers and savage raiders. When they learn the truth, when they see the evidence of Morrison's real crimes, the captain will find himself very much alone." Sarah moved closer to study the financial records, her young mind already grasping the implications of what she was seeing. "These numbers. They match what Mama wrote in her journals about the mine's value. Morrison wasn't just stealing our silver, he was stealing from lots of people. Dozens of fraudulent claims." Harrison confirmed. "Murders disguised as Indian attacks, legitimate miners driven off their land by threats and violence, territorial officials bribed to look the other way. Morrison has been building a criminal empire for years, and your parents just happened to discover the richest prize he'd ever seen. The plan that emerged from the long night's discussion was audacious in its scope and complexity. Rather than fleeing or fighting a hopeless war, they would go on the offensive against Morrison's entire network. Using the silver from Elizabeth's mine, they would hire the best lawyers in the territory, buy influence where necessary, and turn Morrison's own corruption against him. Sarah would testify not as a fugitive hiding in the wilderness, but as a protected witness in the territorial capital surrounded by federal marshals and honest lawmen who owed no allegiance to Morrison's criminal organization. It was dangerous. Morrison would certainly try to silence her before she could reach the courthouse. But it was also their best chance of ending the cycle of violence and securing real justice for Thunderhawk Elizabeth William and all the other victims of the captain's greed. The journey to the territorial capital began on a cold morning in late autumn, and the high mountain air sharp with the promise of winter. Sarah rode in a reinforced wagon with Judge Harrison, while Stone Bear and 25 of his best warriors provided escort. The silver from the mine traveled with them, carefully hidden, but ready to buy whatever justice money could purchase in the corrupt world of territorial politics. The party moved carefully through country that grew more dangerous with each mile. Morrison's response to Harrison's defection had been swift and vicious. Federal troops had been redirected to hunt down the Indian War Party that had massacred innocent soldiers and kidnapped a territorial judge. Bounty hunters and corrupt sheriff's deputies had set up roadblocks on all the major routes, checking every wagon and questioning every traveler. According to the wanted posters that appeared throughout the territory, Stone Bear was a bloodthirsty savage who had murdered Captain Morrison's men in cold blood, while Sarah was described as a traumatized white child who had been brainwashed by her captors into believing lies about heroic cavalry officers. Stone Bear was forced to take increasingly dangerous detours through wild country, avoiding settlements and main roads entirely. The journey that should have taken 5 days stretched into 2 weeks of hard travel through desert canyons and mountain passes, where early winter storms were already beginning to bite. Sarah endured the hardships without complaint, her young body toughening under the harsh conditions while her resolve grew stronger with each passing day. She spent the long hours in the wagon, memorizing her mother's journals and practicing her testimony, determined to present a clear and unshakable account of Morrison's crimes. Judge Harrison proved to be a valuable ally, coaching Sarah on courtroom procedure and helping her understand the legal implications of the evidence they carried. He also shared his knowledge of the territorial political system, identifying which officials could be trusted and which ones were likely in Morrison's pocket. The key, Harrison explained during one of their evening camps, is to get your testimony before a federal judge rather than a territorial one. Morrison's influence doesn't extend to Washington, and the federal authorities are already suspicious about the irregularities in this territory. But getting to a federal courthouse alive was proving more difficult than any of them had anticipated. Morrison's network of corrupt lawmen and hired guns seemed to cover every road to the territorial capital, and the captain himself was leading an increasingly desperate hunt for his escaped witnesses. It was during the final approach to the capital that Morrison made his most desperate and dangerous play. A full company of cavalry, nearly 100 men strong, surrounded their small party in a box canyon just 20 miles from their destination. The soldiers were accompanied by territorial marshals, federal agents, and a collection of bounty hunters and hired guns that represented the full extent of Morrison's influence. Morrison himself rode at the head of the column, his uniform immaculate, despite weeks of hard campaigning. His cold blue eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory intensity as he called out his final ultimatum. "This ends now, Stone Bear." Morrison's voice boomed across the canyon. "You're surrounded by federal troops with orders to recover the kidnapped child and arrest the murderers of Captain William Morrison, my late brother, killed in your savage raid on innocent settlers." The lie was brazen, but effective. Morrison had created an entirely fictional brother, complete with military records and a heroic death to justify his vendetta against the Cheyenne. The federal agents accompanying him had been told they were hunting the killers of a decorated cavalry officer. Judge Harrison stood up in the wagon, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "Captain Morrison, these charges are completely fabricated, and you know it. I have evidence of your crimes, including financial records that show..." Morrison's pistol shot cut off the judge's words, sending Harrison tumbling from the wagon with blood spreading across his chest. Sarah screamed and tried to reach him, but Stone Bear pulled her back as the canyon erupted in gunfire. The federal troops, believing they were facing dangerous kidnappers and the murderers of a fellow officer, opened fire with ruthless efficiency. Stone Bear's warriors fought back with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered 4-1 and caught in an impossible tactical position. As bullets whistled overhead and men died around her, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She jumped from the wagon and ran toward Morrison's position, her small hands raised high above her head. "Don't shoot," she screamed in English, her voice cutting through the sound of gunfire. "I surrender. I'll come with you." Morrison's triumphant smile was terrible to see as he ordered his men to cease fire. The canyon fell silent except for the groans of the wounded and the echo of Sarah's footsteps on the rocky ground. "There's a good girl," Morrison said as she approached, his voice sickeningly gentle. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, but that's all over now. Sarah stopped just out of reach, her young face composed, despite the terror that must have been coursing through her veins. "I know why you killed my parents. I know about the silver mine and the judge and all the other bad things you did." Morrison's expression hardened like cooling metal. "Do you now? Well, that's most unfortunate for you because dead children can't testify in courtrooms." He raised his pistol, pointing it directly at Sarah's head, with the casual cruelty of a man who had killed many times before. But before he could pull the trigger, Judge Harrison's voice rang out across the canyon. "Captain Morrison, you are under arrest for murder conspiracy and treason against the United States of America." Harrison stood beside the overturned wagon, blood soaking his shirt, but very much alive. In his hands, he held not a weapon, but a thick folder of documents and an official federal warrant bearing the territorial governor's seal. "You see, Captain," Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger despite his wound, "while you were busy chasing shadows in the desert, I was busy building an ironclad case against you. Every corrupt payment, every murdered witness, every fraudulent claim you filed, it's all documented in these papers." Morrison's face went white with rage and fear, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like a house of cards. "You're bluffing, Harrison. You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" Harrison opened the folder with deliberate ceremony, reading from official documents in a voice that carried to every corner of the canyon. "Payment of $500 to Jake Morrison. No relation, I assume, for services rendered in the elimination of problematic claim jumpers. Deposit of high-grade silver ore into your personal account at the Territorial Bank, made 3 days after the deaths of Elizabeth and William Hartley." The federal agents accompanying Morrison exchanged uncomfortable glances. These were career lawmen who had spent their lives learning to recognize the sound of genuine evidence being presented, and what they were hearing had the ring of absolute truth. Harrison continued his devastating recitation, each revelation more damning than the last. Correspondence with Territorial Judge Marcus Webb regarding the disposition of witnesses who ask too many questions. Purchase orders for unmarked weapons delivered to known criminals and bounty hunters. Falsified reports about Indian raids that coincidentally occurred near disputed mining claims. Sarah listened with growing hope as her mother's careful documentation and the judge's investigation painted a complete picture of Morrison's criminal enterprise. This wasn't just about the murder of her parents. It was about a conspiracy that reached into every level of territorial government. The child's testimony is just the final piece of the puzzle. Harrison concluded, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "But even without it, we have enough evidence to hang you twice over, Captain." Morrison's desperate gaze swept the canyon, looking for escape routes that simply didn't exist. His own men were backing away from him, their faces showing the revulsion of soldiers who had been tricked into serving a murderer's agenda. Colonel Peters, the senior federal officer present, stepped forward with his hand on his weapon. "Stand down, Captain Morrison. You are under arrest by order of the Territorial Governor and the United States Army." Morrison's final act was entirely in character. He spun toward Sarah with animal desperation, his pistol swinging around to eliminate the witness who had brought about his downfall. But Stone Bear was faster, his rifle cracking like thunder as Morrison's wild shot went wide. The corrupt captain fell to the canyon floor, his blood seeping into the same red earth that had drunk the blood of Thunderhawk and so many others. Justice, Sarah thought with grim satisfaction, had finally been served. The aftermath of Morrison's death brought revelations that shook the territorial government to its very foundations. His corruption had reached into every level of law enforcement and politics, creating a network of graft and murder that had operated with virtual impunity for years. Sarah's testimony, supported by Elizabeth's meticulous evidence and Harrison's thorough investigation, led to the arrest and conviction of dozens of corrupt officials. Judges, sheriffs, territorial legislators, and federal appointees found themselves facing federal charges as the full scope of Morrison's criminal enterprise was revealed. The silver mine, legally inherited by Sarah as Elizabeth's only surviving heir, provided the funds needed to rebuild trust between the Cheyenne people and the territorial government. Stone Bear negotiated a new treaty that guaranteed his people's rights to their traditional lands, while providing legal protections that had been lacking under the previous corrupt administration. Judge Harrison, despite his wounds, survived to become Territorial Attorney General. He dedicated his remaining years to reforming the justice system that had allowed Morrison's crimes to flourish, establishing legal precedents that would protect both Native and settler communities for generations to come. Chief Stone Bear used his share of the silver proceeds to establish a school where Cheyenne and white children learned together, fulfilling Thunderhawk's dream of peaceful coexistence between the two peoples. The school became a model for similar institutions throughout the territory, helping to break down the barriers of prejudice and misunderstanding that had fueled so much conflict. But for Sarah, the victory came with a terrible price that would shadow her for the rest of her life. She had lost her parents, her grandfather, and her innocence in the space of a few weeks. The trauma of what she had endured would stay with her, always shaping her into a woman who fought tirelessly for justice and truth wherever they were threatened. Years later, as an adult, Sarah would return regularly to Devil's Throat Canyon, placing wildflowers on the spot where Thunderhawk had made his final stand. She would remember his words about family and sacrifice, about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the cost was almost unbearable. The silver mine continued to produce wealth for decades, funding schools and hospitals and legal aid societies that helped those who couldn't afford justice on their own. Elizabeth's final gift to her people had indeed secured their future, though the price had been higher than anyone could have imagined. Sarah never married, dedicating her life instead to bridging the gap between the two worlds her mother had tried to unite. She became a lawyer herself, one of the first women admitted to the territorial bar, using her inherited wealth and her unique perspective to fight corruption and protect the innocent, regardless of their race or background. She established a foundation that provided legal representation for Native Americans throughout the territory, ensuring that the kind of systematic oppression and exploitation that Morrison had practiced could never take root again. Her work helped establish legal precedents that protected tribal rights and sovereignty for generations to come. On her deathbed many years later, surrounded by the mixed-race children she had helped educate and protect, Sarah's final words were spoken in Cheyenne, a prayer of thanks to Thunderhawk, the grandfather who had died to save her, and in doing so, had saved them all. The blood-stained map that had started it all was preserved in the territorial archives, displayed alongside Elizabeth's journals and Morrison's confession as a reminder of the price of greed and the power of truth. Visitors could read the documents and understand how one family's courage had brought down an empire of corruption. And in the desert where it all began, wildflowers bloomed each spring in the exact spot where a 7-year-old girl had stumbled out of hell, carrying the evidence that would change everything. The flowers were said to be the most beautiful in the territory, their colors more vivid than any others, as if the blood that had watered that ground had given them special life. Local legend claimed that Thunderhawk's spirit watched over that place, protecting all children who passed through and ensuring that truth would always triumph over lies. Whether or not the legend was true, the spot became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking justice. A reminder that sometimes the smallest and most vulnerable among us can change the course of history. Sarah had learned that justice was never free, that it always demanded a price from those brave enough to seek it. But she had also learned that the price was always worth paying, because the alternative, a world where the strong could prey upon the weak without consequence, was too terrible to contemplate. Thunderhawk's greatest victory hadn't been the silver he had helped secure or the corruption he had helped expose, but the legacy he had left in the form of a granddaughter who would spend her life making the world a little more just, one case at a time. The desert wind still blows across that canyon where he made his stand, carrying with it the whispered stories of courage and sacrifice that define the best of human nature. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully on quiet nights, you can hear the echo of an old chief's voice, promising that truth will always triumph over lies, and that family in all its forms is worth any sacrifice required to protect it. The blood-stained map had shown the way to silver, but Thunderhawk's granddaughter had found something far more valuable: the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And that, perhaps, was the greatest treasure of all. In the end, the story became more than just a tale of individual courage and sacrifice. It became a symbol of what was possible when people of different backgrounds came together in pursuit of justice, when the truth was allowed to triumph over lies, when the innocent were protected by those willing to pay the ultimate price for their safety. The legacy lived on in the school Stone Bear had built, in the legal precedents Sarah had established in the children of both peoples, who grew up knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves. Thunderhawk's dream of two peoples living in peace had been realized not through war or conquest, but through the simple act of one man choosing to protect a child who carried the blood of both worlds in her veins. And that, more than all the silver in the mountains, was a treasure that would never diminish.